coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Laura. And we're back at it again with more talk about everyone's favorite character, Christopher Hayden. He seemed to always show up at the most inopportune moments for Lorelai and Rory, and the relationships are such a roller coaster ride. So this week we're going to take a look a little bit more closely at all of the times Chris came around for the Gilmore Girls during the run of the show, for good or for ill. Last week we covered the early years of Rory's life. Go back and check that episode out if you haven't already. And since we know very little about those early years, I think it really stems from the writers just not caring to give us so many, just a lot of details about them. But what we do know is what we see through the run of the show from season 1 all the way up until the revival. So now it's time to dissect some of those key moments of drama.
Yep. Before we get too far into things, this is your blanket spoiler warning. We're going to be going top to bottom of the show. And if you haven't seen it and you don't want to know what happens, hit the eject button now before it's too late, because we will spoil some big stuff for you. And, it's not our fault from here on out. You've been warned. And also, while we're thinking of it, if you could quickly do the YouTube things, like subscribe, drop us a comment, disagree with us preemptively, that's cool too. Share this with your friends who are also Christopher Hayden haters or stans. I don't know what your friends do, but yeah, all of those little sort of YouTube things really keep the algorithm happy and really help us out. So without further ado, I'll kick us off. Christopher's first mentioned in the pilot, so we get just like a quick overview of him from a third party, specifically from Richard, being like, well, your father's business in California is doing very well. Lorelai, how's the motel? So, we automatically have this hint of Christopher's success and then condescension towards Lorelai, which we later kind of find out is exaggerated. And then we don't hear about Chris again until he literally pulls up in town on a motorbike. What do you make of that sort of like gap of time and the sort of like lack of focus on him in season 1?
I thought it was a really interesting choice from the writers, because obviously iconic first, shot of the pilot is Lorelai, our lone independent woman, meeting her daughter at the diner for breakfast. And so it becomes very transparent to anyone watching early on, okay, this is a mother-daughter duo. But even from like the first watch and however many times we've rewatched it since then, I feel like the question should have been flagged. It's like, well, where's the dad? But the writing was so strong and the relationship between these two was so like, fireworks that we didn't even really question it. And I think that's telling that like we're not questioning the absence of a father or a second parent or somebody else. And even when, like you said, Richard is so just alluding to him in a roundabout way, like, oh yeah, he's doing well. Can you, pass the potatoes? As an audience member, you would think we would be wanting to know more, but we're really just content not knowing anything at all. And I think that really speaks again to how well our two main women were written. But going back on it, it raises the question for me of like, why were we not asking more about who this mysterious father figure is from the onset until, like you said, we see him roll up. And now all of a sudden it's just, well, here's our answer. But it's, more than halfway through the first season in.
Yeah, that's all true. My initial take on it was sort of like, obviously we needed it in the pilot for just that little bit of context. Like, it's a teenage mother story. We kind of need to know how we got here. So like, you have to at least breadcrumb us a little bit with that. But you're right. You don't even bat an eye because it's so unique and so fast paced. You almost don't get a minute to catch your breath and ask these questions and be like, where is he? We're just so much more consumed with what the girls are up to. And now also for Lorelai specifically, her dating life when it comes to Max, we're more intrigued about like, ooh, who's this guy? And like, is this going to work out? Clearly they're setting this up. And even a little bit of those early flickers with Luke as well. And I almost wonder if they did it sort of on purpose, not because they wanted, well, like partly because they wanted to focus on that relationship and wanted to make it dramatic with her dating one of Rory's teachers, but almost if they wanted to like make us forget that Chris existed so that his arrival in town will be that much more impactful. We'll be like, oh yeah, we forgot that guy was even a thing. Like, oh yeah, Rory must have a dad. Finally, here he is. And so, like, we really only get that one view of him in season 1. And I just, yeah, you're right. It's a very interesting decision on the part of the writers to make him basically a non-entity for most of the first season. And again, it feeds into my theory that the writers wanted to villainize him a little bit. Like, I mean, he wasn't an out and out villain in that episode. Obviously, the villain of that episode was Strobe, but it is clearly wanting us to feel a certain way about him, and the way they go about doing that is like almost giving us, the audience, a sense of he's not even around. Like he's not even anywhere in the orbit to think about or to care about. And it's like a subtle, like, oh, why do we even care about this guy? We don't.
Yeah. And we have talked about it a little bit in part 1, but I just want to pose this question to you. You know, when he's coming back into town and, you know, you're kind of given the heads up, like, oh, like he's going to be back. You know, Rory is made aware of the fact that he's coming back and he's going to be around for a little while. What do you make of Lorelai's remarks to Rory about how, like, hey kid, just don't even get your hopes up. He's not going to be around for long. Don't have any sort of expectations whatsoever, because you could probably wake up tomorrow morning and he's not even going to be on the couch. He'll just have, like, you know, took off again. Was it right for Lorelai to set those expectations for Rory based on Chris maybe having done that in the past or having been absent, whether by choice or not? Or should she have given him a little more grace and said, you know, careful, Rory, but, you know, maybe it will work this time. So try and, you know, make something of this relationship with your father now that he's here and seemingly in a better life place, you know, with a career path, to make something like this actually work out.
It's a fine line to walk for Lorelai here, because I mean, obviously they have 16 years of reference of exactly how much he's been around. And the way she phrases it to Rory is sort of like, he's going to come and go as he pleases, kid. You know that. And so I think it is something that they've experienced before, where he is so ephemeral in their lives for whatever reason. And so I don't want her to be overly positive and create false hopes or allow false hopes to percolate, I guess. But I also think that there is maybe an unconscious element there of coloring her daughter's opinions about her dad more than she wants to. I don't think she intends to crap talk Chris, but the subtle digs and the not only that, but just sort of the more nebulous criticisms of the upper class that he comes from, and just how she feels about that whole world, I think subtly influences how Rory feels about the whole situation. And Lorelai expressly wants Rory to have her own relationship with her dad and to determine her own path with him, which in a way is admirable. But I think that, you know, they're almost unaware of how much influence they have on each other at this point. They know that they're close and they're best friends and that they can talk about anything. But I think Lorelai has an outsized influence on Rory that she doesn't even recognize in just these tiniest of ways over the years, where the little attitudes and the little opinions and all of that stack up into this one sense that Christopher is not a reliable person, and that who he was in the past is who he is now. And so there's this sort of like expectation that is set from Lorelai where it's just like, he'll never change. And it doesn't allow him the space to prove himself. And it's, you know, it's kind of unfortunate that Lorelai has to play that middleman so much, but also unfortunate that she doesn't give Chris more of a chance to demonstrate any kind of growth or progression. he's in his 30s now. And it doesn't feel quite fair to just say, or like to just write him off entirely and assume that he's incapable, unreliable. Just it's not great. And actually, I think at the end of that episode, it's really interesting that Rory says, I still say there's something different. And it turns out that she's right, because very soon after this, he gets together with Sherry and we really start to see him on an upward trajectory. And so Rory has this instinct, because she knows her father as well, maybe not as well as Lorelai does, or in a different way than Lorelai does. And I think Rory has a clearer picture of him because she doesn't have quite as much baggage about it. Lorelai has a lot of baggage that she specifically tried to keep from Rory, and things that like Rory doesn't have to absorb for herself necessarily.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I think it's a really excellent point that you just made, that it was Rory who was noticing something different as opposed to Lorelai. And maybe it was just because she was just at this point wanting to keep her eyes shut, so to say, to any sort of new and improved Christopher, especially when we have Max in the picture. She has tried to make things work with tried to make things work in the past with Chris, and it has not, so he's not an option right now, or someone that she even wants to consider as a romantic partner. And so maybe she's just more inclined to be like, it's easier for me to shrug him off and not notice any sort of growth that he's had. Whereas Rory, it can very easily see like, he's not fully there yet, but I see that he's slowly taking those steps to get to where he wants to be. And maybe this visit back to Stars Hollow was that first step of just saying like, hey kid, I'm starting to do a little bit better. Let me try and buy you a dictionary, be a little more involved in your life, start taking an interest in how your education is going, how's Chilton? And I think, again, it's just very interesting that Rory noticed that growth and Lorelai was just blind to it.
Yeah, like I said, she still thinks that he's 16, basically. And I think there's a difference between rightly calling people out on their BS and setting expectations about how to be better, and assuming that a person who has made a mistake will continue to make that same mistake and that they can't be trusted. I think that's kind of what Lorelai did, where it's just like, well, it's just going to be more of the same. I know it. And in a way, she's not entirely wrong, but I think I mentioned this last week, but sometimes it takes doing something and getting used to structure and adapting to a new lifestyle and a new set of responsibilities to actually be capable of those things. There are certain things you can't just sort of like hit a certain age and be like, boop, I'm ready. That's not how life works. You have to just jump in and do the scary bits. And she's not recognizing that that's how that works, even though that's exactly what she did. She doesn't externalize that onto him to be like, well, this is how it worked for me, so he needs to do the same. So that was kind of interesting to me, that she just couldn't. You're right. She closed herself off. She didn't want him in the bubble. And I guess that, brings us to the fight near the end of Christopher Returns, where, he says he wants to be a family, and, she calls him out on it and says, you don't know what it means to be a family. It means being responsible to other people. It's commitment. It's coming home to the same place, to the same people all the time. And I think that's a narrow view of family. And it's also like rich coming from Lorelai. It's like, it's just you and Rory. You haven't really committed to anything but her either. And I mean, it's admirable that she did commit and didn't, do something else to avoid having a child, or, let's just say other people have resorted to horrendous things to avoid having children, and or to hide teenage pregnancies. I won't say more than that, because it could be potentially sort of like upsetting or triggering to people. But just, she took on the responsibility, and that's something to be recognized and admired. But she hasn't been able to form a larger family than a unit of two herself. And it kind of goes to questions of like, I've heard the accusation levied at Christopher that he only wants to be a dad to Rory insofar as it will get him Lorelai. He's always loved Lorelai, and he will do whatever it takes to get her, including like pretending to be super dad, only when it suits him or when it's in his interest. But when Lorelai's not on the table, he doesn't even try. And I'm wondering what you think about that. Like, do you think that's actually true, or is that an overstatement or a simplification?
I'd have to call it a little bit of both to be fully fair in what I am seeing. I think Chris is always going to have a lifelong pining for Lorelai. Even after their marriage in the end still doesn't work out. It wouldn't surprise me if there's like a situation, 10 years down the line in Revival 2.0 where he continues to try, because despite it having failed so many times in the past, Lorelai was always, his first love. Maybe in his mind, like, this my soulmate, the person that I feel like I am meant to be with, even though the universe is obviously showing you guys otherwise. So I think there, unfortunately, and it is very unfortunate, that there is a little bit of truth to that statement, that, yeah, maybe he is trying to get, back into Rory's good graces because it will shine a positive spotlight on him that Lorelai will then see and be attracted to, in the sense of like, oh, he's stepping up. He's actually taking interest in being a father. That's appealing. It makes me want to try this again. But to counter it, I also think that Christopher, again, is not, we've said this before, I don't think he's a garbage human being. I think he does have genuine care and concern for his daughter and her well-being. And we'll talk about the times that, his actions kind of start to back that up as well. Even though he's not always there 100% of the time, he does small and or large things over the course of the show to prove to us that, yeah, if I can be here for you, I want to be here for you. And he's even very open and honest about the fact that he hasn't always been, but he says it himself. He's like, I want to try and rectify that. I want to try and be better and be there for you. So he's making that effort as well, even aside from a commitment with Lorelai. And so actions speak louder than words. And I think a lot of the times his actions did back that up.
I tend to agree. I also think it sort of glosses over some of his behaviors. I can think of at least two examples off the top of my head where that just doesn't feel true. The first one being in season 3 after Gigi is born, or like, no, after the fight. It's like early season 3, Rory and Chris resume contact, but Lorelai is none the wiser. So like after she says, Chris, give it time, he honors that and still tries to make an effort with Rory, even if his relationship with Lorelai is still too strained to support going back to their friendship. And, he continues to communicate with Rory throughout seemingly that year. I mean, we don't really know, but we assume they're on okay terms after the baby shower and the birth. And other than the birth, Lorelai doesn't really see Chris again until after Sherry leaves. And that is another time that, or after that is actually another time that comes to mind, when Strobe dies. Sherry has left. He's stuck with Gigi all alone, no supports. And when he finds out his dad is sick and he comes back to town, he goes to Yale. He doesn't call Lorelai. He goes to Yale and knocks on Rory's door and wants to take her to breakfast. And he is very vulnerable with her and says, my dad and I had this wall there and it's there with us too. And I don't want it to be, I want you to want to have a relationship with me. And I think that was, a really great moment for him. So like, again, 2 instances off the top of my head where he doesn't even like bother with Lorelai. I mean, there are obviously moments where he sees an opportunity and takes it, or pines after it, because I think there will always be a part of him that's in love with her, because he's sort of frozen at that age, and sharing a child is a profoundly connecting experience, I think. And kind of going back to that conversation they have in Christopher Returns in the kitchen when they're fighting about him not knowing what a family means, I think he conflates the things in his mind where he's just like, I want the package, you know? If I want to be with Lorelai, then I have to be a family. And if I want a family, it's got to be with Lorelai and Rory. And so it's just this like complex web of feelings of like the back and forth of that, of like, I want it all. So I don't think that he's exclusively concerned with Lorelai. I think his heart really is in the right place, even if he doesn't always feel the strongest of bonds with Rory, because their early years were interrupted by, you know, his pursuit of business success in California and Lorelai moving to Stars Hollow.
Yeah, I agree with what you say as well, that I think he was trying to mesh the two idealizations together, where if I want to be Rory's father, I need to be a father to her with her mother. And it doesn't need to work that way. You know, single parenthood is single parenthood for a reason. We've said this before in a previous episode. You know, you're not always meant to end up with someone that you procreate with. Like, it's just, it doesn't have to be the end game. You can, you know, eventually get with Sherry and be a partner to her and a mother to Gigi and still be a very active father figure to Rory, but not be with Lorelai. Now, going the other way, if you're going to be with Lorelai, I think it would then just be horrendous to just completely ignore Rory or not acknowledge her existence, you know, and turn into like, not even like an evil stepfather, but just like an evil father figure who's just like, I don't really care about you. I'm just trying to get back with mom. But you can be a parent without needing to actively be romantically involved with your child's mother. So I think he just was not able to separate the two, but I think it's just a part of that upbringing that he had, where that's what he was taught. Like that's just how it goes, folks. That's how it shakes out. You know, Emily, Richard, Strobe, Francine, they all, you know, had that mindset of, well, of course they have to get married. Like, you know, they're having a baby now together. They have to. And it's like, no, they don't. And we've talked about that extensively already. So I don't need to, you know, transgress on that any further. But he needed to be able to separate the two. And at that point in time, he wasn't able to do so. I also think that Lorelai calling him out on not knowing what a family is or what it looks like, I think she was more calling him out on not understanding familial responsibility, not understanding what the familial unit looks like, but not understanding the responsibilities that come along with that in terms of providing financially, but also emotionally, and being actively there. And so I think that's more of what she was trying to flag him on in that moment.
She did a real great job of explaining that, because she just, again, she really simplified it and showed that she doesn't know what she's really talking about either, because she just sort of ran and jumped and lived in survival mode for so long. But what you just said, you know, kind of goes back to something else I said last week. I went into more detail about this in that episode. Definitely go check that out if you haven't watched it. But like, yeah, Chris doesn't know what it means to be a father, but I think part of that is derived from the fact that like people in his class look at children not as independent, autonomous beings, but as things to be molded into mini adults. You know, it's sort of a narcissistic extension of the person. It's like, you're a reflection of me. And I think that's, you know, we see this in, you know, parental expectations around academic attainment and jobs and how much money your kids make and all of that. Like, we see how concerned that whole social class is with their legacy and whatnot. And Chris very much comes from that world. You know, kids as a reflection is not a good thing to come from. You know, Chris comes from a long string of people who aren't interested in the kind of parenting that we now know is psychologically optimal for children. And instead, they emphasize that children are a cornerstone of adulthood. It's like you become an adult when you get married and have kids, as opposed to, hey, become a person and then have children so that you know how to instill in them the ability to think for themselves and to develop their own identities and to succeed on their own terms instead of, this sort of prescriptive cycle of breadwinner husband, homemaker trophy wife, a bunch of kids. Those kids go on to inherit the family business, just like that kind of mentality that a lot of the people on this show have, and in real life for that matter too.
Yeah. And I just want to move us along to another point that you just made me think of, again, something that we already touched upon last week too, in terms of trying to understand what that family unit looks like, even if it's not something where it's biological mother, biological father, children, and trying to have that in place, even if there's a different familial unit that's coming to the forefront. And in this case, it would have been Sherry, Christopher, Rory. Lorelai doesn't do him any favors in terms of saying, like, no, she can't spend the weekend with you. Like, are you kidding? Like, I'm laughing that you're even asking. Talk to me about, again, just reiterating how you felt about that choice. When he just wants to spend some time around the holidays with his kid and Lorelai just laughs him off about it.
Yeah, I'm going to back up a little bit because it will provide context for my answer for that question. I got to back up to the Deb ball.
Okay.
One, Chris really shows up for Rory in that episode. And this is where we really start to see that Chris maybe does have it more together than Lorelai thought. In large parts, thanks to Sherry setting some expectations, being like, hey, you need to be a productive adult in the world, and you can't just be sort of like making bad business investments and hoping it will work out, or like, hopping from one thing to another and riding a motorcycle instead of driving a car like everyone else. And he becomes a more desirable version of himself to Lorelai. And Lorelai sees this, and obviously she's flirting with him through that whole episode, being like, look at him, look at this glow up. Like, who are you and what did you do with Christopher Hayden? She's totally into this. And then she finds out that he's got a new girlfriend who was the one who inspired this change. And she's like, oh shit. Huh. That's cool for me. And obviously this is the last time she sees him before Bracebridge dinner, where he makes that call to her. And I think that colors her perception here, because now she's jealous. Before, she might have just been like, I'm not willing to give up my holiday traditions with Rory because, like, she's all I have. Like, this is all we've ever known together. This would be a very big shakeup for our lives. But I think a huge component of it is now Chris is getting it together with someone else. And she doesn't like that she has to share him with someone else. And she's just gotten the card and they look like a cute little family and they got a puppy, and she's starting to see the life that she let slip away. I think before she didn't believe in it. She couldn't conceive that it could ever happen. And now she's like, oh, he is capable of this. And like, this is what this looks like. And I don't like that. I want it. And so letting Rory go be a part of that is just destabilizing to her. So I didn't love that because it was an immature response. Again, she always wants to leave that door open for Chris to see Rory whenever he wants. And the minute it impedes on her life and the insecurities that she has, it's like, no, sorry, you can't see her. Christmas is my time, as is Thanksgiving, Easter, Memorial Day, Independence Day, and January 1st through December 31st.
Yeah. If anything, it's like, oh, I can pencil some Rory time in for you on November,
November 41st.
November 41st between, 2,500 and 2,600 hours. Does that work for you?
Yeah. How about the 12th of never?
But there also should have been a lot more consideration of what Rory wants to in that moment. And it's appalling. I hate it where she doesn't even go to Rory and say, hey, your dad called, asked about you spending some time with him and Sherry around the holidays. What do you want to do? Would you like to go stay with them? And maybe Rory would have just, been like, no, I'm not really comfortable with that yet. I'd like to get to know Sherry a little bit more first before I actually spend a few nights, in their residence. And then Lorelai would have had grounds to say, like, it's a no, Chris, but she's just she's not really comfortable with it yet. Let's talk about why and see what we can do to maybe make this happen the next time a holiday comes around. Or Rory could have just been like, yeah, I would actually really like that and enjoy that opportunity. And Lorelai lets her go. But she just took away all of her autonomy in that moment, and that's not okay.
That's exactly the crux of it for me, is like, Lorelai didn't even give Rory a chance to pipe up. Rory had to be like, it's weird. Usually I hear from Dad around this time of year, and then Lorelai has to sheepishly admit that he did call and invite her. And it shows the depths of Lorelai's capabilities for selfishness and self-interest, and how that might have colored previous interactions with them in the past. I think saying that she's leaving the door open for him allows her to be the bigger person and allows her to appear more magnanimous than she actually is. It's sort of like I said door's always open and you just decided never to use it. And it makes her out to be the good guy when the reality is a little more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I just envision like the door is always open, but you have to step carefully in the doorway leading up to it, because one wrong misstep and it's just going to open up and you're going to fall into a pit of lava. So approach the door, but make sure you get it right or like you're dead. So it's like, it's open, but there's a test to even come inside first that you need to pass. She doesn't make it easy. It's not really wide open, just waltz on in. It's like, I'm going to put you through the ringer first before you can.
Yeah. My previous metaphor has been like, the door is open, but the screen door is locked. You can shout through, but you can't come in.
Yeah.
Or like another metaphor that just popped into my mind was like, oh, sorry, actually the door's locked. You're going to have to use the doggy door. You can fit through that, right? This tiny little window. But it's open. Why are you complaining? Yeah. No, I like Chris in season 2. Obviously we have him showing up for Rory in a big way for the Deb ball. We have him showing up for her in a smaller way by coming to her debate at Chilton.
Mm-hmm.
That's not even a big thing. He's just there. He's in the area. He's like, I am there. And he brings Sherry and is, he's saying good things about Rory to Sherry and expressing his care for her and his desire to be a good dad, regardless of whether that's a front for Sherry or not. Like, that's debatable, I guess. But regardless, like, sometimes you got to fake it till you make it. And like, as long as he's saying it and putting in the work and doing it, it's a step in the right direction. He's like racing against the clock to be there when she breaks her arm after the car accident. He's like, he tries to meet them at the hospital, but they weren't there. And so he comes here and the lights are off and he grabs the key out of the turtle and they were already asleep. So he just grabbed a chair and fell asleep. And, he kicks right into dad mode where he's just like, we'll deal with the insurance. We'll deal with the doctors. Like, I want to, talk to the doctor some more. I got to kill that kid, Jess. Can you show me a picture so I don't accidentally kill the wrong guy? Like,
mm-hmm.
and Lorelai is like, look at you springing into action. I like this. And he's like, just trying to keep up, and then he comes back to when she's getting the cast off. He's just finding excuses at this point to be in Stars Hollow and to show up for Rory and to support her. And he sends Lorelai the nice graduation gift and says some really nice things to her about, you know, you're incredible. I've always thought you were incredible. You deserve this. Congratulations. And then he shows up for the wedding as well, which, you know, is where things start to fall apart. Season 3 gets a little bit rough for their relationship, and we only see him in Haunted Leg and again in Dear Emily and Richard when Gigi is born. And so I say we move on to sort of like the degradation of that relationship. Because we've talked quite a bit about season 2 in the past with him in general. And I think maybe it's a little more interesting to look at the degradation and the breakdown of all of this. Talk to me about Haunted Leg, because I'm curious how you feel about that fight scene at the end when he shows up to dinner and kind of accuses Lorelai of keeping Rory from him. And then Rory finally stands up for herself and says, I was the one who didn't want to talk. You know, I have mom. That's all I need. Go be someone else's dad. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Rory was well within her rights to voice how she was feeling in that moment. And she was obviously very hurt about Christopher failing to keep some promises that he had previously made. I've said this before, actions speak louder than words. His actions were no longer backing up his words. And if that was causing significant pain to Rory, which it obviously was, she had every right to voice that. And I think it was perhaps a slap in the face to Chris, but something that he needed to hear, where it's harsh, but it's like the whole go be someone else's dad. It's like, well, you're not even here for me in the capacity that I need you to be. So just go try that with somebody else and half-ass it, but don't half-ass it with me where it's just going to cause me pain. Now, I don't love the fact that she says, I have mom and that's all I need, because we've talked about the horrendousness of that codependent nature and how even she thinks that Lorelai is all that she needs, but also Lorelai definitely does not meet all of those needs that she has. We've talked about that in the last episode too. I think it's just stemming from just Rory put her hand on a hot stove and got burned by Christopher. And now she's just trying to compartmentalize that pain, try and ignore it, not let herself, address it, because it was what Lorelai had always kind of warned her about, I think, maybe in the back of her mind, where she's like, oh, mom always told me, that dad would pull something like this and that this was going to be, an expectation that I should have of just feeling and being hurt by him. I also think it's important to note how Lorelai is feeling in that moment too, because she's confronting a lot of emotions with Chris that she is also not ready to feel in that moment. And that's why she says, don't you understand that being here right now is hurting me? It is actively causing me pain. Please don't force me to have this conversation. And just in the same way that I told you, you can't force Rory to have a conversation before she's ready. You need to be able to give her time and let her come back to you in her own way. And, when she's ready to do so, let her have her space and let me have mine, because we're both just feeling enormously hurt by you right now for different reasons, but we are, and you need to let us have the space to be able to deal with it and then just come back to you when you're ready. And I think it was a little bit selfish of Chris in that moment to say, well, it's not all about you. Like, it's about me too. I deserve to have access and a right to you. Don't you understand how I've been feeling? I feel like he could have done a lot better in that moment of just really acknowledging, like, I've done damage here. I need to accept responsibility for that and hear what my daughter and, my daughter's mother are saying in terms of space is needed right now. Back off a little bit. It shouldn't have had to gone like and taken Emily stepping in and just being like, leave now, for him to take, like, to get the message and depart. It shouldn't have had to go that far, but he was just, I think, too maybe even a little bit self-absorbed in that moment to realize just the pain that he had caused.
Yeah, that's all interesting. It reminds me of season 7 after the divorce when Rory says, I'm on your side, mom. I'm always on your side. And it's one of those things where Rory and Lorelai are so codependent, as you said, that it's hard for Rory to develop her own feelings, I think, sometimes. And I'm not saying that's necessarily true in this moment, but there are moments, like, Lorelai was so dependent on her as a kid, and she took on so much of Lorelai's emotion and expectation and all of that, and they're so close that she's always rooting for her mom to the detriment of her dad. And like, I don't even know that she knows the full story, at least when Lorelai first tells her about the divorce. Lorelai was equally complicit in that divorce. I know everyone's frustrated that, like, Chris was MIA for a couple of hours, but, like, how was he to know that Richard would have a heart attack in the, like, one day that he's been incommunicado? Like, the odds of that are slim. And so he's just thinking that he's getting some space and taking some time to cool off, and he doesn't know that there's a crisis happening. Like, how can he know? But Rory just sort of, like, hand waves away Lorelai's commitment issues and all of the things that Lorelai did to hurt Chris at that time as well. And it feels kind of the same here, where it's just like, my mom is all I need. Dads suck and are unnecessary. It's that mentality again. And I mentioned this in our Lorelai and Chris episodes when we were talking about this fight as well, in terms of their romantic relationship dynamic more so than his dad dynamic. But, like, you keeping me from Rory, I never thought you would do that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like, where do you get that idea if you haven't experienced this before? I don't think you just pluck that out of thin air. I think he's got a finger on the pulse of that relationship and understands what's below the surface, what's never being said but always being communicated, which is, in Lorelai versus Chris, it's always Lorelai. She always wins. She always gets her way. It's always Lorelai's way or the highway. And it's happening again. And, I think Chris is genuinely hurt in this moment. When we have the lunch between Emily and Lorelai earlier in that episode, Emily says that she talked to him and she's like, he's not in love with that woman. He's in love with you. He wants to be with you, but he's trying to do the quote unquote right thing. And I think if you took him back, he would come running to you. And Lorelai doesn't want that. And so Chris is left in this really sticky situation where his head and his heart are competing with each other. And yeah, I think he does want to be with Lorelai and Rory over Sherry, because I think that's, like, what his heart has always told him. And so now he's put in this really difficult position where he's once again faced with the opportunity. He says it to Lorelai at the end of season 2, where he's like, am I just going to bail again? Like, I missed it all with Rory. I don't want that to happen again. What am I supposed to do? And so he feels pigeonholed into this. And I think that moment of him coming to her fighting is just sort of like, it's sort of the same as Logan at the end of season 6 when he asks Rory, tell me not to go. It's Christopher's version of pleading with Lorelai so that she'll ask him to stay. And that might be his permission to break with Sherry. I think that was maybe what he wanted. And so Lorelai's resistance caused him to retreat into that place of, like, is Sherry still having the baby? Yes. Are you going to marry her? Yes. Then we are where we are. I think if she had been more receptive and more like, I still want to be with you. Like, I don't know why you're picking her. He probably would have been like, okay, we'll be together and Sherry and I will figure it out and I'll do what I can to be there for this kid, but I want to be with you. And I just think he was looking for any excuse to, or any permission. Actually, permission feels like a much better word there. Permission to be with Lorelai, and she wouldn't give that to him. And I don't blame her. That's fine. Again, her call to make. I think Christopher's emotional state there is far more complicated than most people give it credit for. I think a lot of people find that scene to be uncomfortable and cringy on Chris's part for, showing up and interrupting dinner and being so needy or whatever. And you're right, Rory is entitled to express her feelings to her dad, but I don't like the way she did it. I mean, obviously, emotions were running high. No one's really had a ton of time to process all. Actually, no, that's not true. They've had all summer to process this. um, but she's only 17. And I don't know if she's fully unpacked her entire relationship with her dad, because nobody in the Gilmore family ever goes to therapy. I wish she had more insight on understanding her dad better and understanding the situation better, because again, this is a situation. It's not like he's ditching them to go to Vegas to gamble his life savings away. He's got another child on the way. He's got a girlfriend sort of waiting for him in Boston who is now pregnant. It's not just like he's making the impulsive decision to move to Europe. You know, it's like, it's a very different situation. And the fact that she, like, this is somehow the boundary that she draws, where it's like, okay, now I can't trust you as reliable after all of these years. And then shortly after that regains contact and goes to the baby shower, is present for the birth, rekindles a relationship with her dad. You know, it's one of those things where this is where you see the writer's hands too much with Christopher, where it's like, the reason I know that he's only a tool for drama is the fact that we have that line, we have that like emotional delivery from Rory, go be someone else's dad, and then it's just forgotten. Christopher comes and goes as is convenient for the writers, because they never address that again. They never unpack it. They never have Rory refer to it again. We have a faint hint of it in season 5, maybe, when she's concerned about Christopher's potential to screw up Luke and Lorelai's relationship. But like, it's never really contended with ever again. And it's just sort of like, oh, Dad and I are back in contact. This is an invitation to Sherry's baby shower. It never happened.
I agree, because like, even that line alone, go be someone else's dad, you could unpack that in therapy for weeks. And you probably should have, because obviously there's a lot of drama there between father and daughter at that moment in time, a lot of dissatisfaction. Perhaps Rory was even starting to, feel jealous of the fact that, she was not going to be the center of attention in Chris's world anymore if another child was coming into the picture. Also wouldn't surprise me, considering that, Rory always wants it like, it's all about me. But again, I feel like we say this all the time, but it's just because it's true. It's like, go to therapy. You need to talk about that and how you're both feeling in this moment. I think it's also worth reminding that, Rory is still, her brain is not fully cooked, so to say, at this point in time, so she may just not be completely mature yet with how to contend or verbalize those emotions and what she is really feeling. But like you said, we don't circle back on it ever. It's just completely swept under the rug.
Yeah, it's a really dramatic moment for the sake of drama. And it could be so poignant where it's true, because, Rory is certainly not the only person in the history of the world whose father has left their mother for another woman and started another family, or women who have never met their father and then later in life find out that their dad, has another family. It's a pretty common occurrence, a definite source of father wounds for many, many people, to feel like the second choice. I think of another Alexis Bledel property, Sister to the Traveling Pants. America Ferrera's parents are split up. Carmen, that's the character's name. Her parents are split up, and she goes to visit her dad and his wife and her kids, and then she finds out they're going to get married, and it's just like, why couldn't you stay with us? What about me? What about our family? Why did you have to leave my mom? Why did you have to leave me? It's a fairly common thing to be explored in media. And yet, once again, the show just glosses over it like it's not worthy of weeks of dedicated therapy sessions, as you said. It's always sad to me when I realize just how superficial some of these things were. Things that should be important and can be very relatable to people are trivialized by the writers for the sake of moving us on to something else, to keep the girls quipping, you know, to not get too serious ever, because who wants to see that?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Should have done better there, but this is still also mid-2000s. So I feel like even just the concept of therapy and, you know, professional psychological help was still just a lot more taboo than it is here in 2024.
It's true. It's very true. I guess that brings us to maybe Dear Emily and Richard, which is the only other time we see Chris in season 3. The birth of Gigi, you know, and the fact that Lorelai and Rory are both there for it. I feel like that dynamic had so much rich content for mining, you know, of this like kind of weird, unusual, melded family unit. You know what I need, now that I think about it? I need like a Brady Bunch, but it's here's the story of a girl named Lorelai and her ex Chris and her daughter Rory and Chris's new girlfriend and their daughter. Like this weird little blended family.
Writing this down to email to Stan.
Yeah, if anyone can write this, it's Stan Zimmerman. It's the blending of the worlds. It's just, it could have been really interesting to explore that dynamic more of how Chris could still be involved in Rory's life and how Rory could be involved with Sherry and Gigi, and how Chris and Lorelai could come to a better place in their co-parenting of Rory. But, you know, again, Lorelai was just always so determined to do things on her own that she made every single decision. You know, she decided where to live, where Rory would go to school, when to change Rory's school, where Rory would go to college. You know, she implanted that at the age of 4 into her young daughter's brain. You know, Chris was never, ever consulted about any major decisions for his child. And it just extends to everything. And then he gets to be a dad again to Gigi, which we'll get into more in part 2, where he's a very involved father. And, you know, he's the one who's looking for a preschool for Gigi and determining whether it's appropriate to send her to Paris to be with her mom. And it's just, I wish we had seen more of it. They were so focused on Lorelai and Rory that the realities of that life and that family were disjointed. You know, we have Lorelai's relationship with Emily and Richard, and then her relationship with Rory, and like everything else was peripheral to that. And it cut off what I think could have been some really interesting storylines.
Yeah, I mean, you know, at the time that Gigi was wrapping up, you know, then you start, like, it just makes me think of like Modern Family, another show that, you know, did something like that really, really well and really, really beautifully. And it was just, you know, family unions that were, you know, not your typical mom, dad, kid anymore. You know, that had, you know, a mom contending with the fact that, you know, her father had married someone who was her age, you know, a queer relationship, like, and that show was brilliant in its execution of all of that. This show could have just taken like a paragraph out of a page from Modern Family and just shown us a little bit more of what you were alluding to, because it's a more common thing in this day and age to have families that are like that.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that Modern Family came after, because you're right, it was obviously a far more modern take on the reality of the alternate family and how pervasive, common it is in the West now. But even an example that would have preceded Gilmore Girls, Full House.
Mm-hmm.
Single dad, kick-ass single dad, Danny Tanner, his brother-in-law and his best friend raising 3 little girls. And then, you know, Jesse and Aunt Becky and the twins and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just all of the the people who come in and out of that house and move around and change rooms and you know, like 9 people living under one roof in San Francisco. Like, it's so insane, but great. Like, that is the kind of wholesome family viewing that they could have leaned into. Like, there could have been so many funny antics of like Rory babysitting Gigi. Like, I mean, obviously we get Lorelai doing that later, but like, I don't know. Machen Amick is such a wonderful actress, and there's so much chemistry with her and Lauren, and with Lauren and David. That like I think it was underutilized in the name of messing with Emily and Richard more, you know. And again, Kelly and Ed, fantastic. I don't know that I would have wanted to compromise those relationships either, but there's just, again, this show is so long. Like, the scripts are so dense. There's so much filler. And like, as much as we love the weird, stupid town stuff, we could have had some like more meaty side plots that involve the stuff that could have been so good. And I'm kind of mad. But I feel like we're spinning our wheels a little bit on this and should move on to the end of season 3. Obviously, if Dear Emily and Richard is the last time we see Christopher, he's not at Rory's graduation, which is something that the fandom constantly harps on. And in fact, I recall you harping on this in a previous episode. You know, you were pretty vehemently angry that Christopher couldn't manage to show up for Rory's graduation. Like, you drop what you're doing and you show up. And I'm like, I alluded to this last week, but I think David was quite busy that year. And I'm wondering if they literally couldn't get him for an episode because the filming schedule is so tight. You know, back in the days with network television, they would start recording or like start taping in the summers and then, you know, get a bit ahead. But by the time they're recording the later episodes of the season, they're much closer to the actual air dates. And so like they really didn't have a lot of time to play with. And if David wasn't available because he had all these other things going on, then like they had to write him out of that. And so, I mean, that's just speculative because nobody has told us. But, you know, everybody harps on the fact that he sent Lorelai a beautiful gift basket for her graduation, but he doesn't send anything to her. And I'm like, we don't know that didn't happen. Just because they didn't say that it happened doesn't mean it didn't. You know, that sort of argument from omission. But, like, here's my thing. Lorelai is very cavalier about it. She's been extremely critical of Christopher when he's been flaky and absent in the past. And yet, at this point, she's just like, he's traveling for work, but he told us to send lots of pictures. Like, she seems totally fine that he's unavailable for this. It's just sort of like a quick mention that's brushed off. And like, there's no animosity. There's no taking a jab at him in the absence of his presence. Like, you know, they shit talk Chris behind his back plenty. So why was none of that written in this episode if it was such an egregious mistake on his part? So much of the focus of the season, especially in the early part, was his choice to be a dad to someone else, and Rory contending with that grief of like losing the possibility of that family and having a new half sister, and Lorelai giving up the ghost. So to not even address any of that when he doesn't show up for her graduation, it just feels like, I almost wonder if they had written him into that scene and had to change it at the last minute when they're like, shit, we can't get David. And that's why Luke was there. And they had all that talk about like, I wonder what it costs to insure this place. Cause that feels like filler dialogue, you know? That feels like last minute slapdash. We have to, you know, change something up about this situation. And I think they took the opportunity to sort of have that Lorelai and Luke dynamic, because, you know, she's single, question mark. Haven't seen Alex in a while, not sure if he's even still alive. And then, you know, it's clear that she's kind of jealous of Nicole, and so there's this tension that they're playing with there. And so it's more interesting to the audience to watch Lorelai be like, so have fun on your cruise, even though that could have happened in the diner. So why have Luke at the graduation? You know, like, Luke has never come to any of, from what we can tell, Luke has never come to any of Rory's other school events. He wasn't at her debates. he didn't come to, like, when, well, I guess this was after we found out about April, but like when Rory has that Faces of Young Journalism panel in season 6, Chris shows up, not Luke. Luke is Lorelai's fiance at this point. And, you know, it's like if he was truly like the greatest stepdad ever to Rory, wouldn't he be at some of this other stuff? I really truly think that was just sort of like a, well, we got to shoehorn someone else into this plot. Like Suki and Jackson were there because of the in storyline and just the way that they wanted to structure that episode felt so like weird. I know that that Rory is really close to Suki, but like to have Suki and Jackson at her high school graduation when like normally you only get like 4 tickets to those things and have to get extra specifically and hope that your request can be accommodated. It just, none of it makes sense to me. And that's why I think that they literally had to put something together and like change the structure of the episode when they found out one of the key actors was not available.
I mean, I can foresee it. You know, that's a commonality within Hollywood and actor schedules. I will say it doesn't surprise me, I think, as much as it does for you that Luke showed up to Rory's high school graduation. It tracks for me that he would find out about it and just be like, oh, yeah, you know, this is actually, you know, a really significant moment in her life. It's not like, you know, oh, not that her Chilton debates are like, you know, any less important, but it's, you know, not like, oh, I'm just watching a debate team or a spelling bee. You know, this is, you're graduating high school, which is a really significant, you know, marker in anyone's education and in life. So it doesn't surprise me that he was there. I'm not even surprised that Suki was there. Jackson maybe a little bit more so, but I can definitely see what you're saying about how, like, from a writing perspective, I feel like this was just, you know, in the writer's room, it's like, does the left hand know what the right hand is doing? Is like one person starting a sentence and the other person is finishing it, but there's no coordination here. So I can definitely see how it was a little jumbled in terms of just, again, even going back to what you said, it's like, oh, the insurance on this place. It's like, why is that it's not unnecessary dialogue at this point in time? And granted, it's hilarious and it's funny and it's, you know, comedic relief, but it's just unnecessary for such a key pivotal moment that I feel like, yeah, I can definitely see how maybe you're just trying to fill in the gaps right now because last minute you have to.
Yeah, and Suki's kind of bizarro physical comedy where she keeps getting up to take pictures and it's just like, I mean, obviously I love Melissa and she's hilarious, but I'm like, did we really need that? Or are we just like trying to pad this out, but like adding a little bit of time to have her like stumbling through the audience and just being totally obnoxious?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it felt very much like we need to get all these characters together for some reason, and this is the simplest way to accomplish that. Whereas I don't think they had a narrative purpose for Chris. They had one when it came to Lorelai's graduation because they were trying to plant the seeds of how much Chris loves Lorelai and how highly he thinks of her, so that when he shows up in the next episode, it's not like we haven't seen him or heard from him for a while. You know, we have him showing up for Rory with the arm and then the graduation gift and all that. Like it served a purpose to demonstrate that these two were close to getting together. Whereas with the graduation, it's like, we haven't seen him in months and he wouldn't be necessary here for what we need to accomplish in this episode in terms of like Rory's graduation, Lorelai and Suki getting the in, Luke and Nicole going off in their cruise. Christopher's nowhere in there. And so even though it makes sense for him to be at her graduation, from a writing perspective, they don't have the time for that. And so therefore their conception of what's happening here just gets reduced to something a little more like, why is it these random people? Like, I almost feel like, I don't know. It's just bizarre. And Luke's like, oh, I kind of feel like I've been through this whole thing with you. And I'm like, how? Because she was studying in the diner? Like, How were you there for her through Chilton? I don't understand that. This is just, it's like showing, not telling. Or sorry, telling, not showing. I mean, obviously, that maxim has its limits. But again, they try to shoehorn in particular things and make us feel a particular way about characters with lines of dialogue instead of actions backing that up. You know, I really don't see a lot of action from Luke's part that's in any way appropriate in terms of like being a dad figure to Rory. We'll get more into that some other time. I'm thinking of the fight with Dean. That's inappropriate daddy behavior. Just like get out of here with that. But yeah, so the graduation is one that always kind of bugs me, where it's just like, you know, from an in-universe perspective, like sometimes you simply can't get out of work. Like there are just things you can't avoid. And Lorelai and Rory don't seem to be concerned about it whatsoever. And for all of the emotional tumult of that year when it comes to Christopher and Gigi, for them to not even mention it makes me feel like the writers were just not interested in having him there because he was irrelevant to them by that point, which is, again, further reinforced by the fact that he doesn't appear once in season 4.
Yeah. All excellent points. I still will, you know, take stock with him not showing up to his daughter's graduation, but I am not going to rehash my argument there for time's sake. But it's your kid, you know, and that's a once in a lifetime sort of thing. So I get that there are circumstances that are really just not going to allow for that, but I don't buy it here. Again, I'm not gonna dive into it.
And that's the thing. I don't buy it. I don't. Chris has been showing up for her for like 3 years now, you know, like, or 2.5 years by now. He came for a deb ball, he came for a debate, and he can't show up for graduation because the writers don't want him there, and that's why I don't buy it. It's just, I don't know. I think it's a meta issue that they had, and that the writers were just like not even thinking about it, or he was unavailable. But that brings us to season 5, and of course he comes back in to their lives to mess things up with Lorelai and Luke. And, you know, I've mentioned this before where I don't love how Rory goes to him after he leans on Lorelai for support when he's in a very difficult time and doesn't have many people he can call on to be there for him and to talk him up the way he needs right now. I don't love how Rory inserted herself into that situation and tried to make decisions about her mom's relationship with her dad without any input from her mom whatsoever. She tried to step in inappropriately. And that brings us to the lunch at the Dragonfly. You know, it's Chris's first time seeing the place. He brings Gigi for lunch, and Rory chews him out. Like, I don't believe you that you didn't call her. And that whole thing. As it pertains to the daddy-daughter relationship there, this is the first time I feel like Lorelai has sort of a lapse in understanding, shall we say, of the daddy-daughter dynamic. Because she's good with Chris, and so she assumes that Rory is good with Chris. Because usually it's the opposite. Lorelai and Chris will be fighting because of Lorelai's petty jealousy or whatever. And Rory, and she'll encourage Rory to not freeze her dad out just because she is. But in this instance, that's flipped. Lorelai and Chris are on fine terms. Chris is trying to do what Rory is asking of him, in fact, and, you know, trying to keep things copacetic and detached. And Lorelai's the one who's like, no, like, I care about you. I care about what you're going through and about Gigi, and I want to make sure you're okay. And I want to spend time with you. And Rory takes it upon herself to be like, hell no, because she's like, again, it's sort of like, it's been 2 years since the wedding fiasco, and all of a sudden she's mad that her dad wants to be around, like, and that, you know, she can't trust her mom to handle her own relationships. It's just, it's the first time that Lorelai seems to miss the fact that Rory's relationship to her dad is so mediated by her own regardless of whether she tells her to keep things, separate or not, and to keep things going with her dad, even if they're fighting. Yeah, it's just really the first time that there's a disconnect in their communication about their relationships, and it's the first time that it's sort of like Rory's not cool with him when Lorelai is fine with him.
Yeah, and it was well within Chris's right to reach back out, and say down the line, especially like, I need help, I need XYZ. I could really use some support, even if it's not, as you lending support as a romantic partner anymore or someone in that regard. And these are all grown adults who have the right to interact with whomever they please. It's not Rory's. If it makes Rory uncomfortable, she needs to contend with that herself and address why it's making her feel uncomfortable and what the underlying issue is there that is leading her to feel that way. And then she needs to, again, unpack that for herself or in therapy for whatever the reason is, figure it out, and then have a mature conversation with Chris about, your presence here makes me uncomfortable. Can we talk about why? You coming back into mom's life gives me pause and I'm uneasy about it. Can we talk about why? And just have a mature discussion about it. But Rory was never doing that introspection or that self-work to figure out why it bothered her so much. She just let it consume her. And then she would just lash out at Chris about it. And that's a very unhealthy response. And it's never going to get you anywhere other than, have both parties kind of just at each other's throats for the misunderstandings and the lack of consideration.
I think she bottled up so many of her feelings throughout the years, especially for her mom's benefit, that now they're just spilling out everywhere. She can't really like control her emotional response to this and have that mature conversation as much as I wish she would. There's too much baggage now on Rory's part as well. Lorelai had her own all those years, and now Rory is developing hers and it's not even because of anything Chris necessarily, well, it's kind of because of what Chris did to her, in that he broke that promise to be with them as a family. But she had that for like 5 minutes. It's not like he was there for 6 months and then Sherry found out she was, or like he finally found out Sherry was pregnant and she was like 6 months along and he's like, I'm sorry, I'm leaving you. It's not like they even had a chance to do it. It was sort of like dangled in front of them and then pulled out again. So it's like, how long were you really counting on that? I don't know. And yeah, I think it's because she always repressed her own feelings or was in some sort of denial about them as a way of protecting Lorelai in this, which is not good. Your children should never be responsible for your feelings. Lorelai relied, I think, too heavily on her young daughter to be her emotional support system and to be her cheerleader and to be on her side. Mm-hmm. And it really impacts Rory, and I think that's why she's going off the deep end here. It doesn't make it okay. I understand it. That's all I'm saying. But it's not okay for Rory to interfere like this. And yeah. But I guess that brings me to women of questionable morals when Chris comes to Rory's dorm. And I really like that moment, I think it's really just a moment of honesty and vulnerability from Chris where he expresses his regrets directly to his daughter, and not only his regrets, but his fears about the future of their relationship. And it just feels very earnest. And it's a shame that it took him this long and it took a crisis situation for him to have these revelations. But I think it reveals his character that, deep down he really does care about Rory and he cares about their relationship and he wants to work on it regardless of whether he's on speaking terms with Lorelai or not.
Yeah, I agree. And, we've talked about this extensively, but Chris was a 17-year-old who was thrown into a position of potentially having to take on fatherhood. But even after that no longer became a primary responsibility, I feel like Chris was very slow to grow up. And it's not his fault, but I think he was held back by being able to take on life and grow up and mature, probably a lot of because of his parents as well. So in this situation, it's cliche, but I really think it is good that it's like, okay, well, better late than never. You know, he needed to take the time to get to that moment of actualization and speak with Rory in that way, and just acknowledge, like, I have so many regrets here. I messed up. I was not the father figure to you that I could have been, that I should have been. I want to be better about that now. And if it took Chris, if he needed this long to get there, that's okay. And so I think it was really good that there was like some warm reception to that, and that he's having that moment of clarity and that moment of growth, because he could have not, and he could have just remained stagnant and immature and never gotten to this point. But he's actively over the seasons, just even if it's like turtle paced, he's growing and he's progressing and he's doing better for himself and his life, which allows him to be better for Rory and the other people in his life that are important to him by extension.
Yeah, I don't love Rory's reaction to him when he initially shows up. Well, what you said there made me think of her seeing him come to her. He's clearly in a state, like, he's not shaven, he's wearing like a t-shirt and a jacket, he looks a little rough and he looks really sad, and she won't even hear him out. It's like she's so determined to be cold and detached and to punish him for what she perceives as slights and wrongs against her and her mother, that when her dad tells her that his dad is sick, she doesn't even bat an eyelash. She doesn't ask any follow-up questions like, oh my God, what is it? How sick? How are you holding up? Like, she's just like, I have to get to class, and it's a page right out of the Lorelai playbook, frankly, where it's just like, all that matters is us, and your internal world and whatever you've got going on is of no consequence to me, because you're just a terrible person and I don't want to deal with you. And it just totally ignores Christopher's struggles and his grief. And, she has to reckon with that later when she gets the news from Emily. And, she has to go to her dad and be like, I'm sorry, I wasn't really listening. Here's milk and cookies. Let's talk. And then all we get out of that is like, we had some things to figure out. And I think we pretty much figured them out. And I'm like, this is a show about family dynamics and like messed up family relationships, and you can't even like address what the problems and solutions to the family problems are. Goodness gracious. But another thing you said sort of reminded me of a point that I wanted to make, where it's just like, Chris thinks Lorelai is so special that she was just automatically a good parent. You're talking about the turtle pace of slowly crawling towards efficacy, basically. But he has this idea of Lorelai as Superwoman. And it's like, oh, well, she's just naturally good at everything. She's just naturally good at this, and I'm not. And so he kind of takes the position that, like, no work has to go into it, I guess. Lorelai points it out to him in season 1, where it's just like, families are work and commitment, and a lot of work went into getting her to pretty good, it's weird. She's inconsistent, where sometimes she's like, Lorelai or Rory's a self-cleaning oven. She's like a Honda. She's low maintenance. And then with Chris, it's just like, well, a lot of work went into this, Christopher. Like, 1 minute Rory is basically raising herself, which true, frankly. And the next minute she's telling Christopher, how hard it was. And he doesn't totally get that. But I think, imagine how messed up your worldview has to be to think that parenting is easy, and that like some people are just naturally good at it and others are not.
Yeah. And Lorelai is really a misnomer here, because we've talked about it before. What she did as a teenage mom, and she had a lot of help from Mia. She definitely had some, handouts, assistance, however you want to refer to it. She didn't do it on her own, even though she likes to credit herself for that. She had a lot of help along the way, but to still accomplish what she did as a teenage mom who leaves home with an infant, who is just approaching toddlerhood, no prospect of even having a roof over their head, where that roof is going to come from, where the next meal is going to come from, and then establishing a life with a small child and continuing to work to provide and be successful in that regard. It's still a huge accomplishment and one that's noteworthy, but it doesn't make her holier than thou. It just means that it was a combination of luck and hard work and resiliency, but it doesn't make her a better person than anyone else. And it certainly doesn't make her a better person than Chris, just because, again, like you said, in his mind, she's superwoman, super mom. She was everything that I could never be. And it's like, don't do that to yourself, Chris, because now you're just not giving yourself credit for, you getting to the point that you're at right now, which is also very significant and should be applauded.
Yeah. All true. All right, let's skip ahead to season 6. He's not in it a ton. I do love that he shows up kind of last minute to go to the wedding with Lorelai and is a solid friend there. But I think his most significant moment with Rory in that season really is why am I blanking on this all of a sudden? I had it in my brain ready to go. The paying for Yale. That's what it was. Christopher is not even a name Lorelai thinks to call when contemplating money for Chilton. Not sure why. Again, she probably doesn't want to be beholden to him. Doesn't care for financial support or anything from him. Never asks, never accepts. And here we are with Lorelai pitching this to Rory and being like, your dad offered to buy you a brewery, a cannon, Oompa Loompas, pay for Yale. Rory takes him up on it. And, he's just genuinely happy to be able to do something for them. He offers anything they want. He's like, I can buy you anything to make up for the past, Obviously, money doesn't solve all your problems and it's not going to erase the years of hurt and struggle. But it's one of those things where it's just like, Lorelai didn't have to struggle the way she did. She could have asked for or even demanded help, financial or otherwise, from Christopher. That is his responsibility as the other parent. And she never did it. And so she can't hold it against him that he never contributed financially. And I don't think she does, but the fandom does. The fandom is just like, why couldn't he ever do this before? And now he's trying to buy their love. And I'm like, no, I think he genuinely comes from a place of wanting to contribute and make up for the fact that he couldn't or didn't before, regardless of the reason for it. He does just want to contribute. He has more than enough and he wants to share it, which is a generous thing to do regardless. Because some people who are millionaires and billionaires don't do anything good or productive with their money. They just store it offshore and let it appreciate as if they could ever use that much money. And so I like that he's like, I'm going to set up everyone so that they're as financially comfortable as I am now. I want financial comfort and security for you. And I'm so happy to do that for you. And so I love that he does that. And he also offers to retroactively reimburse her for Chilton. And she says no. So what do you think of that?
I mean, I'm okay with that. I think it's good to be measured in accepting assistance. And I think it's definitely okay for him to want to pay for Yale at this point in time. I agree with you. I don't see it as just, I can see how some people would be using money as a Band-Aid to rectify a situation. And maybe even in Emily's case, she always uses money as I can just, I can hold this over your head forever because I floated you. Chris was never going to do that. He was not going to be the person that 10 years down the line, even next week, came back and said, well, I'm paying for Yale. So, you better come to dinner twice a week, or, You know, I better see you at Gigi's birthday party. Like, he wasn't going to make demands of Rory or Lorelai for the contributions that he was now making. I think, again, it was just genuinely him feeling like, I'm finally doing something good for my kid that I just didn't have the sustainability to do before, you know,
the
but
chance.
and now I can. And I think it's just a wonderful thing that they're letting him. But it doesn't mean that you need to accept all the help or like all of that reimbursement. So like I'm okay with her saying like, you know, no, Chilton was good. It was taken care of. You know, we're just thankful for what you're doing now, you know, and anything that you may continue to do moving forward.
Yeah, excellent points. The other thing I find interesting about the whole situation is how Emily and Richard react. It's just like, how convenient that he's her father now. I find it very amusing that Christopher is suddenly such a wonderful person. It seems to me that when I was in cahoots with him, everyone thought that he was a villain, or that I was a villain, and now suddenly you're in cahoots with him, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Not the same, Emily. Not the same. But again, Emily seems to always have like a little bit of like the finger on the pulse of what's like hypocritical or truly going on in a situation that Lorelai can't even see herself. And I think this might be one of those times where it's just like, yeah, why is it suddenly okay for him to come in and you know, do something for you when before you locked him out at every turn?
Yeah, because people grow and change, Emily Gilmore. Thank you and good night.
Not in ASP's world, they don't. And I guess that kind of brings us on to season 7, which doesn't have a ton of remarkable parenting moments for me. I think it's more about Lorelai and Chris's relationship, which we've discussed in previous episodes. But the one thing that really does stand out to me is Go Bulldogs when they go to Yale Parents' Day. Mm-hmm. And he hears the dads talking about, you know, we were there through the volcano projects that erupted and we had to do like $5,000 worth of repairs to our floors. We were there for late night study sessions and, you know, getting our kids through AP courses and getting them here to Yale. And Chris just feels so woefully underqualified and inadequate in this moment because he didn't get to do those things. He can't rightly claim any responsibility for Rory being at Yale now and for helping her get there. And he's meant to feel bad about it. Like he's the one who bears the whole like, ooh, I wasn't there. But refer to my earlier comment about the fact that Lorelai was the one who made all of these decisions. And, you know, seemingly they never invited Chris to school stuff until season 2, you know, until Rory was already 17 and already at Chilton. Like, if he wasn't given access or decision-making involvement or sometimes maybe even updates about these things, like how is he supposed to feel involved in this process? And so I think it really shows, like, I feel like the show tries to make it out to be about what Christopher didn't do, but the reality is closer to look at how alienated he was.
Yeah, I agree. And the point that I continue to drive home is that Chris is still actively trying. He is still showing up when he can, making the efforts that are within his, you know, capabilities to do so. He may not fit in at Yale with the other dads, but, you know, I don't think we should expect him to. You know, he's just got to take it a day at a time, you know, reinsert himself healthily into his daughter's life, you know, and get there and just put in that work. And again, this is just another example of his actions backing up his words, where he's not just saying that he's going to do something, he is actively showing and proving that he is interested in maintaining a regular role in Rory's life.
Yeah, actually that brings me back to season 6 and the paying for Yale thing, which is like, because he was paying now, Lorelai and Rory were like, hey, you know who might like some Yale sweats? Your dad. And, you know, maybe invite him to campus and give him a tour and, you know, like, just show him around. Like, enjoy. It's one of those things where he lives up to his end of the bargain. He does it without expectation. And as a result, he's welcomed in warmly in a way that Emily wasn't because of the financial control aspect of things. And she could learn something from Christopher here. calling out Lorelai's hypocrisy is correct, but also take note, Emily, because this is how it's done. But yeah, it's true. It does feel kind of like him staying true to his word and putting in the effort, you know, like even Lorelai hasn't been to Parents' Day. She's like, it's lame. It's only for parents whose kids don't want them there any other time. Like, I got to yell all the time. And he's like, but I'm excited. Like, I want to be part of this like official Parents' Day thing because I haven't gotten to do stuff like this before. Like, this is new and fun for me. I'm embracing this, and I like that. So, and I guess last but not least, that brings us to the revival, where again, it's just a fairly brief scene, but it's one that's loaded with so much meaning and so much information maybe that we didn't really have before, because we have you know, Rory finally confronting her dad about how he felt about Lorelai raising her alone. You know, look, your mom did what she wanted to do. I really wasn't consulted, but you let her do it. It was in the cards, Lorelai and you, from the first moment I saw you two together. No one was getting between you guys. Maybe that's why she's getting married now. You're grown. Her job is done. Now she can let someone else in. So she didn't let you in? I'm not saying that. Is that why you weren't there? Because she made the decision and she pushed you away? No, not at all. We were just so young, and Lorelai was, well, much like yourself, she was a force of nature, just uncontrollable, sure about everything. I couldn't compete with that, so I didn't. But you could have fought her on it, talked her out of it. Have you ever tried talking your mom out of anything? And, you know, he's not saying directly that she didn't let him in, but he's not saying that. Like, that next thing that he says is just like, Lorelai was a force of nature. What else are we supposed to take from that? Yeah, she pushed him away. And this is like one of the first times we get Christopher's feelings about this, where he was just like, I couldn't compete with that, so I didn't. She was uncontrollable. I could not have talked her out of this. Have you ever tried talking your mom out of it? Like, again, he had no say. He had no control. He couldn't reason with her. He wasn't consulted. Bottom line. And he's trying to soften the blow for Rory, and I think he's also maybe trying to save Lorelai's face a little for her, like trying to make Lorelai seem gentler and more reasonable in light of what happened. He doesn't want to crap talk Lorelai here, and I respect that. He's softening the edges of what was probably a very, very difficult time in his life in order to keep Rory's vision of her mom alive.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an accurate way to put it. He could have definitely said, well, yeah, your mother essentially ruined my life at the time by yanking you away from me. I can't believe she made such an abhorrent decision. You know, it damaged me for years, and I'm still trying to recover from that. So yeah, I absolutely have so much regret about what your mom did, hostility about it. He worded it in a way that was, like you said, probably even more compassionate than it needed to be, because she did do a very damaging and hurtful thing by not giving Chris the access that he could have or should have had to Rory, whether or not he was ever able or going to take her up on it or not. I think, you know, obviously we've talked about why Rory is coming to him in this moment and asking that question, because we know at this point in time, you know, a child for her is coming as well. So she wants to, you know, hey, should I involve Logan? Should I not involve Logan? You know, what's going on there? We've already had that talk. But I like what you said about how Chris definitely saved face for Lorelai. And I think that's just, again, showing something that we alluded to before, where it's like, he's always going to love her. I think like Lorelai is always going to be, you know, the one that got away, you know, the one that I always thought that I was going to end up with. The love is never going to, you know, completely be eradicated. So I just want you to understand that, like, your mother did something that was hard to contend with and work through these past few years and, you know, the better part of the past 2 decades. But I understand her reasoning for it. And it was just an excellent conversation for them to have, and just really great how he worded it to her.
Yeah. What you said there about he loved her. He says that. He's like, I was stupid, but I loved her and you. And people have harped on the fact that he used loved in the past tense. And I'm like, I'm all for unnecessary pedantry, but seriously, and people are also saying like, oh, he mentioned that he loves Rory secondary to Lorelai, and they use that as justification for he's only using Rory to get to Lorelai justification or side of the equation. And I'm like, I don't think so. Like, first up, he went 3 blocks out of his way to get the good coffee for her because the coffee in the office sucks. He says it's good to see her. There's always time for her. She thanks him for squeezing her in. And, harping on one little like grammatical choice of the writers, as particular as they are about their grammatical choices, in order to make him out to be a huge jackass, just ignores the rest of the context of this scene where he's like, he's again squeezing her into his schedule. He's talking to her. He's and like later in the conversation, he also reiterates, he's like, I love you, right? And she's sort of like weird and cold and detached, and I think he thinks she's mad at him when really we know she's stressed about being pregnant herself. But obviously there's also the whole like, do I enter in a cloud of sulfur? Like, please don't make me out to be too much of a villain. Like, and I think I'm wondering what Amy meant by that line. Like, are we supposed to view him as the villain, or is this supposed to be a humanizing moment for Chris? Because Eileen, like, the feeling I get from it is the latter, where it's like, please don't make me out to be too much of a villain. I loved her and you. And so I think that sort of provides a little more context from Christopher's point of view that we've only now, after 20 plus years, been given about him. That even though he made a lot of mistakes, it was because he loved them. He, at the end of the day, cared very deeply about these 2 girls/women. And, now he was going to have his story told by someone who has not always had the smoothest relationship with him. And he's like, what is going to be reflected back to me about this? Like, is it going to be really ugly or not? Like, please don't make me the villain in your story, because I don't know that I deserve it. And I think he's kind of right. Like, I don't think he is the villain. He has his moments where he's a thorn in everyone's side, but I don't think he's a villain.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it is meant to be humanizing, which is surprising coming from the writers. But again, at this point in time, and season 7 obviously was its own thing because Amy and Dan were not involved at that point in time. So Chris was obviously written differently than probably what we would have got had they still been involved. But it's a nice but rare choice for them to show Chris in a positive light. And I think it is meant to just allow the viewer to say, like, again, it's something that I've said in last week's episode. Show me the perfect father. Put that in my path. And a lot of people is like, oh, well, it was always meant to be Luke. But Luke was never a perfect dad either. Far from it. He definitely misstepped a lot as well. So Chris made mistakes. He owned up to them. He took responsibility for them. He constantly tried to do better. In the revival, he is still trying, even as his daughter now is, entering into her middle-aged years, to continue to be there for her. And I know that, as he becomes a grandfather, he will continue to be there both for her and for her daughter, because, spoiler, I think that's what she's having. I think Chris is going to spend the rest of his life just making up for all of that lost time. And we should allow him the flexibility to do so.
We've gone a little long, and I'm going to try to make this short, but I hope that if we do get a second revival, that we do have Granddaddy Christopher, but I kind of want them to recast him with Peter Herman. No relationship to Ed, but like, seriously, go Google Peter Herman, and it's like, he's like such a carbon copy of David Sutcliffe, but even more attractive and not a right-wing conspiracy nutjob. So yeah, I would like to see more of this and to see him be an involved grandparent now in this new phase of life, that would be really, really a beautiful progression. Again, they don't love letting their characters progress. Amy wants to keep everyone stuck in these BS cycles of generational bullcrap, but show me some character growth, man. Just please, for the love of God. This is why people listen to stories. They want character growth. They want that kind of triumph, and we never get it with Christopher. He's just always supposed to be a disappointment, even when his actions aren't objectively like terrible or villainous. And it's just kind of frustrating how, he's beaten down and treated like a little puppy who can't do anything for himself. So yeah, I couldn't abide by the fact that like he was pretty realistic for the first 3 seasons, and then by seasons 5 and 6 it was very clear that they didn't respect him as a character, and that again they were just going to use him whenever it suited their fancy to drive drama, drive a wedge between Luke and Lorelai, to draw out what was already the longest slow burn relationship in the history of television.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. But at the end of the day, what we get is we're on our way back up, folks. Roller coaster dipped down a little bit. Back on the up curve, on the upswing. Just echoing what you said, if we do ever get Revival 2.0, please, dear God, and thank you. I would love to see the return of Granddaddy Christopher. I think that would just be really sweet to see those interactions.
Yeah. All right. I guess that wraps us up for this week. We already went over what we said we were going to do. Classic us. Come back next week because we're going to do one more episode on Dad Chris, specifically more of his relationship and parenting with Sherry and Gigi, because that feels like a whole topic unto itself, and it was just going to be impossible to totally weave that in to what we just talked about. And so we sort of glossed over those sections of seasons 3, 5, and 6 and 7, and even the revival a little bit. Not much of it in the revival, but come back next week for the cap to this whole discussion and for our final thoughts on Dad Chris.
Yep. In the meantime, in case you have not heard the good word, there is an event happening this fall in Guilford, Connecticut from October 18th through 20th. If you are a Gilmore Girls fan, this is the event for you. It is an entire weekend just dedicated to the show, to trivia, bingo, panel discussions about different content. Cast and crew from the show will be there. There have already been a couple of announcements made. If you want more information on that event, we will include a link to it in the description below. Go check out the website and consider buying a ticket to it, because you will not be disappointed. It's the most wonderful and magical weekend, and the attendees are some of the most, just warm and welcoming people that you will ever meet.
Yeah, I'm so excited to go back. I'm really excited to stay up drinking with Nick Holmes. So if you want to join us doing that, definitely make sure you get a ticket before they're gone. It's just such a wonderful, wonderful time, and I'm already mentally packing in my head. So,
yeah.
And on that note, before you head out the door, if you could take a moment, if you haven't already, to do those YouTube things, hit that like button, subscribe, drop a comment, share this video. Every little bit of interaction really helps us, and we're super glad for it. It's pretty easy. Yeah. Thank you for being here, and we hope to see you next Friday for dinner.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.